Hi, I'm Scott McGregor. Welcome to Railway Adventures Across Australia.
Of all the states, Victoria and Tasmania reflect our British heritage the most. Regal architecture, a more European climate, and a connection with England that is no better illustrated than in the railway history of both states. As with the rest of Australia, in the early years, both railway networks spread out in search of the great wealth this country had to offer. Wool, gold, silver, lead and zinc. Following these railways is like following a treasure map. And that's exactly what we're going to do. Many of these lines are long gone, but their history and legacy remains in the places we'll visit. Now, if we're talking rail history and rail heritage, then there's no better place to start our journey than in Seymour, right in the middle of Victoria. This fascinating place is the holding yard for Victoria's historic carriages. Established in 1983, the Seymour Railway Heritage Centre cares for, renovates and maintains a vast array of rolling stock for V-Line, the Victorian Government Railway. There's a steam locomotive here and a couple of diesel locomotives, but it's this carriage that really turns me on. This is the Yarra parlour car, and it's the personification of opulence for the Victorian-era rail passenger. It was built in 1906 of cedar and blackwood. You had to pay a premium to travel on this carriage, and it's not hard to see why. This is one of the finest restorations I've ever seen. The Yarra parlour car operated from 1906 to 1937, between Melbourne and Albury on the Victorian and New South Wales borders. It was at Albury, in those days, that passengers had to change trains for Sydney, because of the different gauge. I could really handle a journey in a car like this. This is Royal Car number 4. And, as the name suggests, it was once meant only for the exclusive use of royalty. There were only 6 of them ever built. This car's most recent brush with royalty was in 1983, when it carried the Prince and Princess of Wales from Melbourne to Ballarat. The late Lady Di sat right there. This carriage was definitely built with the public face of royalty in mind. A single bed here, a single bed there, and in between, a discreet panel. The transport to our next destination is a little more down to earth, but a wonderful bit of Victorian railway history just the same. I feel like a kid who's got Dad's car for the weekend. What a little beauty this is. It's a rare diesel electric rail motor. It was built in 1932 at Victorian Railway's Newport workshops. They reckon it's the last one of its kind still running on the main line. Her official title is RM58. But she's better known to those who look after her at Seymour as Daisy. For 60 years, Daisy faithfully served the community. Now her runs on the main line are restricted to special charters, and I'm told she hardly ever misses a beat. In a day, she was also the model of versatility, carrying first and second class passengers, plus 2 or 3 freight wagons hitched onto the back. Next stop, Echuca and the mighty Murray River. A colourful past hangs over Echuca like a cloud of steam. It was once the biggest inland port in one of the busiest railheads in Australia. Last century, the locals called this place the Meeting of the Whistles, because it was here that the riverboats and the steam trains came together. From the 1860s, wool from the outlying stations would be loaded off the boats onto the trains and sent down to the clipper ships waiting at Port Melbourne. The riverboat era brings to mind all kinds of evocative images. Men and women working their way up and down the river, competing for cargoes, towing barges, navigating the ever-changing and sometimes dangerous waterways with their shifting sandbars and hidden snags. Life at Echuca Port was closely tied to the rise and fall of the river, and during the summer months, paddle steamers tied up to the trees on the riverbank. At the first rise of the river, skippers and crews would get up steam and head off to compete for cargoes in faraway places, making life in Echuca a rough and ready affair. At one time, 79 hotels quenched the thirst of the rivermen. In the 1870s, over 100 boats worked out of Echuca, bringing in tens of thousands of bales of wool a year. The wharf is something of a wonder. It was over 1 kilometre long and was designed in 3 levels to allow for the 10-metre rise and fall of the river. The boats could keep on working no matter how high or dry the Murray became. Built entirely of river red gum, the wharf was resistant to rot, but not to Victoria's expanding rail network. As more and more wool towns got their own railheads, they no longer needed Echuca. By the early part of this century, the river trade was all but dead, and scores of boats were left to rot on the muddy banks of the river. The PS Adelaide was built in 1866 and is the oldest wooden-hulled paddle steamer still operating in the world.
Hey, skipper.
The real trade now, of course, is tourism, but river skills need to be as keen as ever. I wanted to talk to Adam, the skipper, about these skills, but I had to change hats first.
So we're dragging a barge today, right?
That's right. We're just dragging the D26 barge, which is a logging barge.
Yeah. This is pretty tricky, manoeuvring a barge up the river, I imagine.
It is. You have to concentrate a lot, and you have to watch your crew as well, because if you get slack in the tow line, you can knock the crew off the boat. But we're coming up to a blind corner. As you can see, we can't see around the bend.
Right.
So you give a 6-second blast,
Right.
and that lets people know that you're coming.
The Adelaide worked as a logging boat until the trade dwindled. Then she was left for dead. In 1960, she was lifted out of the mud and carried off to be the centrepiece of a council rose garden in Echuca. Then, about 20 years later, she blossomed again. The Port of Echuca restored her from top to bottom, including her magnificent old engines. A living, breathing testament to the wonders of early steam technology. Quite possibly, the Adelaide's in better condition now than when she was brand new. Whatever the case, she now plies the mighty river proudly, with a new lease of life and the rightful title of First Lady of the Murray River Fleet. Wherever the miners and wool growers created wealth, the trains came in hot pursuit. In the 1880s, the boom decade for railway building, more than 8,500 kilometres of track was laid around Australia. The station here at Maldon opened in 1884. Just 30 years earlier, this locality hardly even qualified for a mention on the map. Then overnight, it suddenly found a place in history with the discovery of vast quantities of gold. In fact, it's said, in today's prices, Maldon yielded over $990 million worth. Today, Maldon survives to tell its own story. Yesterday's ramshackle gold town is today's heritage gem. So many of the original buildings are still here and intact that the whole town has been classified by the National Trust. In fact, Maldon was the first place in Australia to be officially deemed a notable town. People flock here to get a real feel for the old days. Like the boats at Echuca, the railway has adapted to tourism, taking people on joyrides 40 minutes up the track and a long way back into the past. Maldon, of course, is just one part of Victoria's dazzling gold history. Not far away are a couple of places which knew even greater wealth.
Not bad for a country station, hey? Anyway, back to the gold. The reason I've come here is to explore this country because of all the gold production in Australia, 9/10 of it came from Victoria. The main gold producing areas were Ballarat and Bendigo. In fact, here at Ballarat, it was the largest alluvial gold deposit in the world at the time.
Like the station, many other flamboyant buildings in the city reflect the extraordinary wealth that flowed from the discovery of gold here in 1851. Within 20 years, Ballarat was a gracious city with a population of around 50,000. Few gold towns grew as rapidly as Ballarat or remained as prosperous once the rush had ended. Ballarat is now the largest inland city in Victoria and a treasury of 19th century architecture. But in the early days, things were pretty makeshift. This is the gold mining township of Sovereign Hill. It's a very accurate recreation of Ballarat between 1851 and 1861. Sovereign Hill itself is actually built on the site of some of the very first diggings in Ballarat. It provides a fine insight into what life must have been like in those early days of the goldfields. In the first 4 years of the gold rush, Victoria's population quadrupled as people poured in from all over the world. For the miners, it was a tough existence as they competed for riches along the banks of creeks and gullies. Miners had to contend with terrible living conditions, extremes of cold and heat and disease. At first they found easy pickings, panning for nuggets of gold along the rich alluvial sand and gravel. But the surface supply was soon exhausted and the men were forced to start digging for the gold. Another early hazard was the oppressive, corrupt policing. Miners faced big fines if they didn't have a gold licence. They were constantly harassed by the police. Eventually, the search for gold turned to quartz reefs deep beneath the surface. Wondrous steam-powered beam pumps became a common sight, pumping out the water which constantly leaked into the underground workings. The blacksmith's tools were no longer enough. Now in the late 19th century, the mines resonated to the music of the heavy machinery made in Ballarat's great foundries. The common theme was steam, the driving force behind a battery of machines designed to stamp and crush the quartz and release the precious gold. "120 kilometres away, another steam-driven burst of power enters Bendigo, the other great boom town of the gold rush era. These two magnificent R-class locomotives, the greyhounds of the rails they used to call them, have brought people from Melbourne on a very special mainline excursion. They've come to celebrate Bendigo's colourful Easter Parade, an event which also carries a very special connection to the early days of gold mining. Bendigo's flamboyant Victorian architecture also speaks volumes about the immense riches pulled from the ground in this region. But there's another story to be told in Bendigo. In the 1850s, the gold diggers who flocked in from around the world included tens of thousands of Chinese. These are the Chinese Gardens, part of the Golden Dragon Museum complex in what was once Bendigo's old Chinatown, a memorial to the Chinese fortune seekers who came here. They travelled from the Pearl River Delta west of Hong Kong, fleeing severe poverty and land feuds brought on by the opium trade. They boarded ships for what they called Dai Gum San, or the Big Gold Mountain, better known as Bendigo. A leader of the Bendigo Chinese community, Russell Jack, says the Chinese played a huge and not always happy part in the history of the goldfields.
Well, I think what you have to understand firstly that most of them were indentured. And they had to try and find enough gold to send back to China to pay their landlords because they had paid for the fee for them to come out here.
The Chinese were attacked by other miners and often reduced to fossicking in mullock heaps left by others.
To stop them coming to Victoria, they put a £10 head tax on them. Well, because they spoke a different language, they ate different food, and they worked very long hours, they treated dreadful.
What were the conditions like?
Oh, it was shocking. Very, very harsh indeed, and everybody shunned them. And not only that, you know, there were no women out here either. They didn't want them to breed.
That was a lonely existence for them.
Oh, yeah, lonely existence. A lot of them died very young age because of loneliness and sicknesses that they never encountered back in China.
The Golden Dragon Museum houses a magnificently colourful collection. It illustrates Chinese culture and heritage to perfection through life-size wax figures, carefully modelled and costumed. In 1882, to establish the collection, the Chinese community raised £750 amongst themselves. With this money, they imported more than 100 crates of processional regalia. boasts one of the finest collections of Chinese ceremonial artefacts surviving anywhere in the world today. Every Easter, the Chinese spirit steps out of the museum and takes to the streets as part of the annual Easter parade. Sun Lung, the imperial dragon, is the centrepiece of the Chinese presentation for the parade. At 100 metres long, he's the world's longest imperial dragon. He's woken each spring festival to the clamour of drums and cymbals and the thundering of firecrackers in order to be made ready for the Easter Monday March. The carnival itself dates back to 1869 and is said to be Australia's oldest surviving carnival. Dragons have been part of the parade since 1892. In fact, Bendigo has long been known as the #1 dragon city outside China. Sun Lung, carried by over 100 volunteers, attracts enormous crowds and generates massive goodwill every year. Times have changed. Today, amid the loud bangs of firecrackers, China and Bendigo seem very much at peace. And at the end of the day, over at the station, the steam enthusiasts settle back for the perfect journey home to Melbourne. We're heading in another direction. There are some places you just have to visit, even if the train doesn't take you there.
This is the old branch line to Mansfield, the line up to the high country. Foggy, isn't it?
The first train rolled along this line in 1891. The last train ran in May 1977. Not a bad run, I suppose.
Now the line's being transformed into a bushwalking and horse riding trail. Great new use for the old permanent way. You know how I feel, though? Still like to see an iron horse riding on it.
To see her roar beneath the trees and flash by gullies deep, and hear the echo when she's gone, rush back again to sleep. Through Kerrisdale and Homewood, the green light lured her on. Click-clack o'er points and crossings, the Mansfield train was gone.
When the line was opened up here to the high country, it completely transformed the sleepy little town of Mansfield.
6 large timber mills were soon built close to the line. Cattle yards and stock loading facilities were put in place. Being such a charming little place with an abundance of good, clean, fresh air from the mountains, school excursions, holidaymakers and honeymooners became an almost daily sight on the station platform. During World War I, hundreds of horses and young men were loaded onto trains here and sent off to war. Today, it's still a major tourist centre, and the high country maintains a special place in the Australian landscape. amid the tall mountains and deep gullies, there are many lingering legends. This old place isn't so old. It's Craig's Hut, and it was built just a few years back for the movie The Man from Snowy River. Cattle are still roaming parts of the high country, and horsemen still herd them down to the plains each year before the snow comes. But there's almost an irresistible movement at the stations. The last of the tough mountain men are slowly being squeezed out by the pressure to conserve beautiful areas like this. Another legend looms large here. The 6-foot figure of Ned Kelly, Australia's most romanticised outlaw. He and his gang killed 3 policemen from Mansfield, robbed 2 banks in the area and held up a train. The end of the Kelly gang came at Glenrowan. Wearing his now famous homemade armour, Ned and the gang had a deadly shootout with police at Jones Hotel, in which Ned was wounded and captured. He was carried to a shed at Glenrowan Station, where his armour was removed. He had 28 bullet wounds, but miraculously survived. Ned was taken by train to Melbourne, where he ended up in the cold, dark dungeons of the old Melbourne jail. He was hanged on the 11th of November, 1880. Melbourne, the capital of Victoria, is full of memories of the past. Like Bendigo and Ballarat, the wealth obtained from the goldfields is reflected in these buildings. And no better example exists than the Legislative Assembly in the Victorian Houses of Parliament. With its 24-carat gold leaf ceiling, it's acknowledged as one of the most ornate buildings in Australia. But our next destination is a fair way away, and unfortunately, it's a journey no train can do. We're heading for Tasmania on this ferry, the Spirit of Tasmania. The overnight trip takes 14 hours from Melbourne, through Port Phillip Bay and directly over Bass Strait to Tasmania. Just a little off to the west, as we pass out of Port Phillip Bay, lies one of the most spectacular coastlines in the whole of Australia. The Great Ocean Road winds its way from Torquay to Peterborough, some 300 kilometres of rich, ever-changing scenery. Sculptured by the sea over thousands of years, the limestone cliffs at Port Campbell rise dramatically from the sea, presenting a jagged yet grand panorama of arches, gorges and islands. Exploring Tasmania by train is difficult these days because there are no regular passenger services left anymore. But there are ways and means. We've been invited to join Don River Railway here in Devonport for a very special commemorative mainline trip around the state, using a combination of these beautifully restored steam locomotives and carriages. The event we're celebrating is the centenary of the Emu Bay Railway, Australia's oldest private railway. It runs between Burnie and Melba Flats on the west coast of Tasmania. For 100 years now, Emu Bay Railway has transported ore concentrate from the mines on the west coast up to Burnie. And it's still going strong today. Emu Bay represents a wealth of mining and rich rail history, the very essence of Tasmania. On our celebration journey, though, we won't be restricted to the west coast of Tasmania. Our itinerary takes us to all points of the compass. So let's climb aboard and get going, because ahead of us is a meandering journey through mountains, rainforest, pastures and wilderness. And what better way to see it all than from the window of a train? The west coast is our first destination. To get there, we'll travel along the north coast of Tasmania from Devonport to Burnie, then down the Emu Bay line to Melba Flats, and then on to Queenstown. Western Tasmania is a wild and romantic place, inhabited by few people and many ghosts. Once minerals were discovered here, towns grew up out of nowhere and just as quickly disappeared. Dozens of small gauge railways were built because they were the only way to efficiently transport ore and people through the impossible terrain. There were more privately owned lines here on the west coast than anywhere else in Australia. We're going to have a look at a couple later, but in the meantime, we're headed for Queenstown, still the centre of mining activity in the region. For hours, we meander through lush pasture and rolling hills, and past a generation of livestock unfamiliar with the sight and sound of steam. Eventually, there's a discernible change in the landscape, and the glorious scenery gives way to something else. Rich green changes to stark brown. When you see these hills, you know that Queenstown is not far away. Queenstown remains the west coast's largest town. It's a neat grid of small wooden cottages against a backdrop of incredible moonscape-like hills. Unfortunately, these bare hills are the result of some commercially successful but environmentally disastrous smelting practices in the past, and a heavy call on timber in the early days for firewood and building materials. Slowly, the vegetation is growing back of its own accord, though I don't think the hills will ever fully recover. Some local people like it that way. Pat Hull is a miner's widow and local artist. She's been a Queenstown resident for most of her life.
So what's your opinion about the look of Queenstown? I mean, is
I love it.
You love it?
Yes, I do.
A lot of people would think that's quite odd, but why?
Where would you get colours like that? Especially at sunset, is it magnificent?
I suppose it does tell a story.
Yes, it does.
I suppose you wouldn't like to see the copper smelters start up again.
Definitely not. Especially when you didn't see the sun till about 1:30 in the day.
Is that right?
And it went again about 4:30.
So was
in
there a
the
smell
winter.
over the town?
Oh yes, it smelled of sulphur.
Sulphur? That's not a pretty smell.
Acid rain, but we
Acid
didn't
rain.
know it then.
Queenstown stands as a memorial to the excesses of the industrial age here in Tasmania. This is Pengana, now a fine guest house. It was, for 100 years, the home of the general managers of the Mount Lyell Mining and Railway Company. In true Victorian fashion, they built it on top of a hill so that the captains of industry could overlook the workers in the town they owned. Mining for copper in Queenstown is still very much alive and well, but carried out in a completely different way. I'm sure that if it was possible to bring an old miner back from the dead and show him how it's done these days, he would be absolutely terrified at these science fiction-like scenes taking place up to half a mile below the surface of the Earth. But let's get back to the old days and those little narrow gauge trains I was talking about earlier. Like so many railways in Tasmania, not much remains. But at the end of this little 2-foot gauge line, there's a real survivor. Meet the locomotive Wee Georgie Wood. This loco was once the only link between the township of Tulla and the rest of Tasmania. Hey, Bill.
Yes, not too bad, thanks.
Tell me about the name, Wee Georgie Wood.
It was named after a comedian in the 1920s, a small comedian, and the logo was named after him by the people here.
The small township of Tulla was established in 1900. Wee Georgie came on the scene in 1924. This little train worked tirelessly, bringing people and goods in and taking ore out to meet the Emu Bay line up until 1964, when the highway opened and the railway became redundant. Wee Georgie was headed for the scrap heap, or ending up as a monument in a council park. But that was not to be. The thought of Tulla's little workhorse being laid to rest stirred the feelings of the local people, and the train was rescued and returned to its former glory. But perhaps the most amazing of all the little lines was the Abt Railway. Now gone, it was built by the Mount Lyell Mining Company in 1894. Its purpose was to carry minerals and passengers from Queenstown to Strawn on the coast. The building of the railway is a wonderful story of courage and struggle against adversity. The train ran through the steepest rail inclines in the world, 1 in 16 grades, and needed a special third track. The system was invented by Dr. Roman Abt for similar steep situations in mountainous Europe. The middle rail had 2 rows of teeth that engaged with a gear on the locomotive to help pull the train up. On its journey, the train crossed many wild creeks and rivers, including a wooden bridge 1/4 mile long. Over a century after it was built, the route the line took is still clearly visible.
Oh, so it's a separate system to the cylinders.
Local man, Viv Crocker, has researched the story about the building of the Abt Railway.
Well, a very large ore deposit by this time. People that had walked through this area from Strawn, the prospectors, people forging north to look for riches, had found a way through the bush and the rivers, basically. And then, of course, the company decided, well, if they can get through this way, we must be able to get through another way.
For the surveyors to find a way through this bush, which has virtually remained unchanged to this day, was a feat in itself. It's pretty rough country, mate.
It's rough. You can imagine we're walking along a civilised bit. When these old guys walked in 100 years or so ago, they would have found the country like this all around them. They would have found a jungle, virtually.
Many people in 1894, including some of the surveyors working on the project and many of Mount Lyell's shareholders, believed the railway was a waste of time and couldn't be physically achieved. But the engineering principles used by the builders were right on the mark. An example of the engineers' innovation and ideas is this bridge at Tipukana. It was shipped out from London in sections, assembled on pontoons and floated into place. The engineers then sank the pontoons with sandbags and secured the bridge in place. The whole operation took 3 months. The small town of Tipukana flourished around this bridge, but today there's nothing. Once there was a wharf, a school, a police station and a hotel and about 40 homes.
So, where are we now?
We're at Rhinadita, the apex of the line. We've got Strawn behind us. We've got Queenstown in front of us. And this, of course, was the 220 metre above sea level high point of the line. There were 2 lines here.
Double track here.
Double track here. Locos would water from the overhead gantry. They had water tanks built up into the bushes
And
up on the bank.
this is?
This is the gantry.
Right.
2 locos would frequently pull here and re-water.
So this would be a major interchange with trains coming and going and watering?
Yes.
And
There were a little small village along behind us. There were 3 little homes there where
Nothing
the
left of
fellas
that?
lived. Nothing left of it, unfortunately. The families who lived here, of course, serviced the RAC and serviced the Abt.
A bit isolated for the people who are up here.
I guess it was, but of course they would have said no, they weren't, because they had small trolleys that ran frequently through the line for shopping and school and so on. So yes, they would say probably that they had the best service around. The trains were very reliable, and I suppose that they ran on time.
This little train really was the lifeline of the district, because at the time it was the only way in and out of the area. When the railway was finally closed in 1963 and the rails removed, one of the most precious potential tourist assets that Tasmania possessed was lost. Nowhere else in Australia could such a trip be made, through dense and beautiful rainforests and mountainous country. Moves are afoot and government finance has been made available to restore the Abt Railway to its former glory. And who knows, one day soon the little train of the mountains, with its shrill whistle and billowing clouds of steam, will run into Strawn Station once again. You know, riding on a steam train like this reminds me of all the things that were going on in Tasmania at the same time as the minerals were being discovered. The timber industry, for example, was and still is very important. It's time for us to leave the rugged west coast and head for those other destinations I mentioned and look at a few other aspects of Tasmania. We're steaming north again, retracing our steps and heading over to the northeast corner of the state. We're going to stop off at Paingana and visit an interesting bloke who works in the timber industry. Logging these days is not carried out like it was in the old days. A lot of the work now is done by heavy machinery. More efficient, more cost-effective, they say. But Sandy Richards is a man who thinks differently. Sandy believes that the methods of the past are too good to simply throw away forever. Sandy has a special licence from the Forestry Commission. They allow him to fell and pull out no more than 3 logs a day for bridge work as required. He's worked in the timber industry all his life and cares very much about the welfare of the forest. In fact, One of the reasons he still uses a bullock team as opposed to a truck or a tractor is that the bullocks do far less damage to the forest. He reckons that the scrub grows back more quickly than when modern machinery goes through it. He does have one piece of the 20th century at hand, though. So, Sandy, this is your one concession to modern technology, this chainsaw?
That's it, yeah.
And you've got the bullocks tethered just in case they take off?
You got the handbrake on, hold them back.
Sandy's first job on the big tree itself is to cut a large wedge in one side so that it'll fall in the right direction. This tree, by the way, is about 60 years old. It's regrowth forest that's been logged before. Then he cuts on the opposite side and the job is done in no time.
Come down here, watch the limbs, come back here. With the dart. Yeah,
Chopping the tree down is one thing. Getting it out of the forest is another. The language Sandy uses sounds funny to us, but the bullocks understand it, and that's all that matters. They each have their own name, like Bluey, Dart, Bowler. And they certainly know when Sandy is talking to them directly. Although he put it down where he wanted it, the log can't be pulled out in a straight line by the bullocks. A little skillful manipulation is required.
He's done that before.
With a diesel tractor, this job would be easy. Just push everything out of the way. But Sandy says this way is better, and I agree with him.
Whoa! Devon. Way, whoa, whoop, whoop, back, way, whoop, back. G Bauer, G back, spark, Bluey, not nimble, G nimble. Get over, Devon, Devon. You got to push him on your arm.
Sandy is the last of the old bullock drivers who actually uses a team on a full-time commercial basis like this. When he goes, a lot of these skills will disappear with him. And what a loss that will be.
G back. Could be the egg of the bowler.
Sights like this seem to leap right out of the past, don't they? Like something from an early bush painting. We're on our way south now. Our Emu Bay Railway centenary celebration is drawing to a close, but not before we manage to take in a bit more of what Tasmania has to offer. These are the beautiful northern Midlands, looking as much like one of the home counties of England as anything I've seen. Further south, and we're into the Derwent Valley, a rich agricultural garden nurtured by the spectacularly beautiful Derwent River. Derwent Valley is only a short distance from Hobart, our next destination. Among Australia's capital cities, Hobart ranks second in age only to Sydney, and second to none in its beauty. Few Australian cities have retained so much of the 19th century. European colonisation started in 1803, when Lieutenant John Bowen took a party of convicts up the Derwent River and established the settlement of Hobart. The infant town took some time to become established, and it wasn't until 1857 that Hobart Town, as it was then called, came of age, when it was incorporated as a city. Although very much a 20th century city, Hobart still retains a comfortable feeling of the past through places like Salamanca Market, where the local craftspeople gather every Saturday to sell their excellent wares. Tasmania is steeped in history, and nowhere more so than the penal colony of Port Arthur, about an hour's drive south of Hobart. Port Arthur is the most recognised symbol of Australia's 19th century convict system. When Governor George Arthur opened the penal settlement in 1830, he decreed that prisoners should undertake the most unceasing labour with the most harassing vigilance. The place certainly lived up to those edicts in its time as a penal colony, right up until the last cell door closed in 1877. Port Arthur has also served as a source of inspiration for many artists and writers over time. One of the best known would have to be Marcus Clarke, and his realistic portrayal of life here in the novel For the Term of His Natural Life, a dramatic story of inhumanity and suffering. In 1927, Clarke's story became one of our earliest feature films. But there's another reason for coming here, and it's a fitting end to our railway adventure. Port Arthur is the birthplace of rail in Australia, because it's here that the very first railway was built in 1836. There's not much to see here now, but it's still a story worth telling. It began here at Norfolk Bay and was used to carry goods and people to the penal colony. Liz Patel, a guide from Port Arthur, has studied the history of the old line.
It was a very short way. It only took about 30 to 45 minutes for convicts to push those wagons across the railway.
So convict powered?
It's convict locomotion, we like to call it. Yes.
4 convicts per wagon pushed the carriages with all their might, sometimes up very steep hills.
It's obviously quite strenuous going uphill this way.
This is a serious incline up here.
It is. It goes up to about 90 metres above sea level.
And what they were pushing, what, about a tonne?
Yes, yes.
Tonne or more?
Yes, yes. Oh. Of course, it would have been much more fun going down.
It would have been great going down.
Yes, and they could actually reach speeds up to about 40 miles an hour coming down.
Right.
Yes, and of course the convicts had to counterbalance as they went round the corners, leaning out to make sure that the carriage didn't topple, but occasionally it did, and accidents did happen.
Right.
And of course it was the officials that got tipped. And then when the convicts came up to brush them, pick them up and brush them right down nice and neat, they often picked their pockets.
Ah, okay.
They did quite well. But here we can see some of the formation.
The rocks are all laid out as if it...
Yep, and you can even see the gaps possibly where they actually had the sleepers going across.
Okay,
Yeah,
so that's where one of the sleepers would have been?
Yep, that would have been where one of the sleepers were, in here.
This is what remains of the original jetty, the last remnant of Australia's first passenger railway. And here, where the railway story began, is not a bad place for us to end. Port Arthur, the last stop on our railway adventure across Australia.